Hi there, this is Zella King from Henley Business School. This podcast is about employee retention. I'm going to be talking about two papers, one by Cappelli on a market-driven approach to retaining talent, and one by Hausknecht on targeted employee retention. To get you into this topic, I want you to imagine that you're a manager at Google. One of your employees, a very loyal and capable person who you really value, an excellent performer, comes to you and says, "I'm really sorry, but I've got a rival offer of a job at Facebook. Facebook are offering me a 50% bigger compensation package." What would you do as a manager in that situation? You might want to pause the program and consider your options. Well, I'm going to suggest that one of the things you might have thought of was to offer to match the pay package that Facebook are willing to pay. Another option would be to say, "Okay, I'm sorry, we can't match that, but thanks for working for us, goodbye and good luck." Or perhaps you could persuade the person that they'd have better career opportunities if they stayed at Google. Well, all of those three things would be what would be called retention strategies. So what is retention? The word really refers to efforts by employers to retain the current employees in their workforce. Retention is desirable for lots of reasons because of the cost of employee turnover, dents in productivity, impact on morale when people leave, and retention is a particular concern in industries where there is high levels of turnover, for example, in the retail industry, leisure, hospitals, teaching, nursing, those kind of situations. So these papers, they're about retention, but they're actually about targeted retention. So what I want to talk about in this podcast is what do we mean by targeted retention and what insights can you get from these papers about that subject? Well, think again, as a Google manager, presented with a situation where you're concerned about employee turnover. Think whether there might be different categories of employees that you might care about more and some that you might care about less. So, for example, would you take more effort to retain a senior manager who's been with the organisation for a long time, a very highly experienced engineer who's worked on the search functionality of the main Google search engine? Would you perhaps feel less concerned to retain somebody who works on the sales team providing customer service to small companies? Would you be concerned about keeping your chef in one of your restaurants or one of your cleaners? So these are all employee groups that you might want to consider in a retention strategy, and you might reach the conclusion that the impact on the organisation of some groups is greater than the impact on other groups. So I'm going to take each paper in turn and just say a few things about it that you might want to bear in mind, and then I'll draw together some conclusions at the end. So turning first to Cappelli's paper, one of the things I really like about Cappelli's paper is that it has really good examples with a strong business rationale. So you've got the example from Prudential, where they think carefully about which employee groups they need to retain. You've got an example from UPS, where they decide that they can change drivers' jobs and improve the retention of drivers who are costly to train by dividing out some of the jobs and giving it to less trained people. These are lovely examples, and I can imagine it would be a great thing to do to put those into a coursework or put those into an exam question as a compelling example, especially as Cappelli provides a strong business rationale as well for each case. Something else to note about the Cappelli paper is that it's very much focused on the employer's perspective. So it talks about strategies that the employers could adopt to address issues of turnover and retention. It doesn't so much consider the reasons why employees are leaving. I really like some of the examples later in the paper where he talks about how organisations might even work together and take a coordinated approach. He talks about some engineering firms in Southern California responding to problems where one firm has a large number of employees to lay off and another firm has an employee shortage, and their coordinated response to that situation. And he talks about another little case study there, which I like, is the idea that sometimes people stay because they are very committed to their teams, rather than necessarily that they're very committed to the organisation. So efforts to foster team loyalty might actually be very powerful in retaining people, although he also makes a good point, which is that then the implications of a decision to restructure that team would be all the more difficult because you'd tried to foster a good team spirit. Something to bear in mind, though, about Cappelli's paper is that this is written in Harvard Business Review, which is a journal really intended for senior executives to read, busy people who don't have the time that you have to pore through academic articles and try and make sense of them. So Cappelli draws on examples from a number of different companies, but he doesn't provide any real systematic evidence looking at links between what companies do and performance. So he's relying to a large extent on anecdotal evidence, which is fine, but what you need to understand is the limitations of that. For example, to what extent do those illustrations that he gives apply in another situation. Turning now to the Hausknecht paper, this is a huge sample of tens of thousands of employees drawn from one industry. So that's one thing to think about. It's only one industry. To what extent do these insights apply to any other industry? But it is an industry in which employee turnover is very high, leisure and hospitality. So therefore, insights into the reasons for staying in that industry could be very valuable. Now, what the Hausknecht paper is doing is looking at the employee's perspective, and rather than asking employees why they leave, this paper is asking them the reasons why they stay. And they articulate two different hypotheses in that topic area. One of them is the suggestion that some of the factors could be divided into what they call desirability of movement versus ease of movement. What does that mean? Well, reasons for staying that relate to desirability of movement are reasons which are concerned with what I have here and why it might not be desirable to move. So if I'm really happy with the advancement opportunities of this organisation or its prestige or its work-life balance, then I am not inclined to move on. The ease of movement factors are factors which relate to how many options I might have elsewhere if I decided to move on. So if I see that the labour market is very difficult and I feel I haven't got the skills to get another job, then I'm less likely to want to move on for that reason. So that would be a reason for staying. So one of their two hypotheses is concerned with thinking about desirability and ease of movement, and the other hypothesis is concerned with thinking about reasons for staying that they call relational versus reasons for staying which they call transactional. So what are we talking about there? Well, with relational factors, they're thinking about things which are relatively unspoken and unwritten between the employer and the employee, but are nonetheless very important, like career progression type expectations, which may not be written down, but would be very important. Whereas the transactional factors are things, reasons for staying, which are very clearly quantifiable and written down in a contract form. For example, the pay rate that you're receiving for this job. So a transactional reason for staying could be that the salary is very good here, and therefore I don't want to move on. So Hausknecht and colleagues run through all of these factors in a huge study. One of the great things about the paper, I think, is Table 2, because that really gives you an insight into employees' thinking. Some lovely quotes that really help to illustrate all these different reasons for staying. And they test their two hypotheses, and you can look to see the extent to which each were proven. The hypotheses specifically are concerned with the different reasons for staying that people at high and low levels of job performance might have. So high performers emphasize different things to people who are poor at their jobs, and they also look at whether senior people in the organisation might have different reasons for staying relative to more junior people in the organisation. And again, you can look at the description of the results to find out the extent to which the reasons for staying are different between those various groups of employees. Now, it's important with Hausknecht's paper to realise that they're just talking to employees about their reasons for staying, but they don't actually test or consider the business rationale for particular retention strategies. So they don't really explore what an organisation might do to keep the employees, only indicate what is in the employees' minds when they make decisions about whether to stay or whether to go. A more compelling piece of work would have taken that research further and said, okay, Now we know these various reasons for staying. Let's see whether variations in factors that are identified, such as career progression or pay, actually have any impact on the turnover levels in the organisation or not. So that is a step forward that Hausknecht's paper could be taken on, which hasn't been done in this particular paper. So going back to what is targeted retention, as I said at the beginning, both of these papers are about targeted retention, and the implication of both of them is that you might put different amounts of effort into retaining some employees relative to others. If you really understand the reasons why certain groups of employees are leaving, particularly your high performers, then you may be able to do something about it. Cappelli's paper focuses on they kind of have different types of targets, because Cappelli's paper focuses on which employee groups are valuable within an organisation and suggests that those are the ones that you should be targeting, or even individual employees, like an engineer who has a very sort of niche area of knowledge that will be very difficult to replace. And his argument would be that you think carefully about the business case, knowing that competitors will lure away or try to poach away talent. You need to think about the business case for making an effort to retain an employee. On the Hausknecht side, they're not quite so directive about what organisations might do. They do identify that retention strategies could be different for high performers relative to low performers, and perhaps also for senior people versus junior people. One final thing to note as a comparison between the two papers, I've already hinted at this, is their difference in style and content. So Cappelli's paper is slightly more geared towards the real world of senior executives and managers. It doesn't have lots of statistics and tables in it. It does have lots of really good case examples, but there's only a limited extent to which you can take forward his arguments because they are based on anecdotal evidence. Having said that, they do seem to make a lot of business sense, and I really like the paper. The Hausknecht one is more academic in style. It has the structure with hypotheses and tables of data and findings and discussion. Very good one to talk about in an exam answer or in coursework, where you really need to provide evidence of how employees think, or perhaps how retention strategies might be different at different levels of the organisation. Then you can point to evidence from Hausknecht's paper that yes, this really is the case in the leisure and hospitality industry. So finally, returning to the scenario that I started with, remember you had the employee coming to you saying that they've got a rival offer at Facebook, and I suggested that you might have some options to consider. I guess that in your mind was most probably the idea that you should match the Facebook offer, because of course Google is an affluent company. It's got the money probably to let its salary costs increase without having too much of an impact on profits. So why not pay the employee the same as Facebook offered? Well, that might be the right thing to do, but just imagine the situation develops a little further once you've decided to match Facebook's offer and the employee has decided to stay. Imagine a co-worker then coming, somebody else who does the same work as that person and is operating at a similar kind of level. Imagine the co-worker coming to you and saying, I just heard that Jim got a pay rise. I do the same work as Jim. I should have a pay rise too. Now you've got a situation on your hands where you've got other employees who, although they haven't been out into the external market to test the value of their talent, they are nonetheless disillusioned about their pay packet. Do you raise their salary as well? And if so, what kind of precedent does that set for other people also coming to you? Or do you not raise their salary and end up potentially with a low morale person who might have been very happy with their salary before, but now is feeling despondent because they're being paid less than a peer? So it's not easy, retention. I hope this podcast has given you some insight into its dilemmas, and enjoy reading the papers. I'll see you in the next podcast.